At the risk of restating some things that have been said this morning and at the risk of preaching to the choir, I think it's worth firstly reflecting on who we are as PowerHousing members and why we're here. I mean, we are a network of leading community housing providers in this country. Between us, we're currently managing more than 38,000 units of housing, and we're providing a place to call home for some 80,000 people. We're raising new capital and we're delivering an increase in supply in our own context. But we're doing that against a backdrop where around Australia there's 100,000 people that are homeless. Around the country there's some 750,000 households that are in housing stress, and the other statistics that we've heard point to a housing system that is under significant pressure. On the current trajectory, our social housing system is broken. It's a system that's been a critical safety net for Australians. It's often been a pathway as people have sought security of tenure and affordability while they've addressed other issues in their lives. And it's provided generations with an opportunity to build the necessary pathways into market rent or home ownership. It's been a springboard to opportunity. So failure to address the trajectory of the social housing system is unacceptable. In every jurisdiction around the country, the percentage of housing that comprises social housing stock is declining under the weight of a public housing system that perhaps once was the envy of the world and is now increasingly being crippled under a range of policy settings that have entrenched it and residualised it to the extent that it's now devouring itself in the process of trying to survive. And we've heard, when you extend this further to the consideration of the broader affordable housing, there's a significant challenge for us in our housing system. In the coming 60 years, Australia's population is predicted to reach 46 million people, which means we need to increase supply by around about 186,000 dwellings per annum between now and 2050. And whilst we've achieved that in the last 2 years, it's considerably more than has been achieved on average over the last 20 years. So if we accept that housing is a mechanism for social and economic participation, if it's about strong economies and strong communities, within that context, it's incumbent on every one of us in this room to take the view that we must not accept that our housing future will be any worse than our housing present. So the challenge and the opportunity is to define the housing future we want and to act on those aspirations. And in fact, my challenge to each of you in this room is for you to ask yourself, what will you do? Each of you in this room is a leader in housing in this country. You have a role to play. Your role is more than offering a policy critique. We're quite good at that. We do that frequently and we advise government on all the things that we believe will shape a better system. But it's more than that. Ask yourself, how can you bring about change? How can you use your sphere of influence? What will you do to create a better housing system for tomorrow? So on behalf of our members, PowerHousing recently engaged with KPMG to develop a document we called Collaborating for a Better Housing Future. It was a document that we submitted to the Affordable Housing Working Group, and it's the start of a process of articulating a view and a vision for the future. In the report, KPMG worked with us to identify 6 key outcomes which form a vision for the future of the housing system and look at what are the things that we think are required to drive towards that vision. Today, I'm just going to talk very briefly about 4 of those that we've distilled out of that document. The first is that clearly for community housing to be a stronger part of the solution in the housing system in the future, we need a long-term, consistent policy and funding framework. It seems fairly obvious when you say it, but affordable housing is only a component of the overall housing market. There are a range of policy and regulation levers that are pulled by a range of different levels of government, and often these are not done in concert, and there's a temptation to only address a part of the market in isolation. It creates distortion in the market and it makes it hard for us to respond. We've seen in our sector, we've seen amongst our membership, how we've been able to respond and bring innovation and new partnerships forward with programs like NRAS in the past. But when there are inconsistent signals from government about the future of programs like this, it drives uncertainty, which makes it hard for other market participants to make the step to partner with us and to provide solutions. So responses to affordable housing need to embed a consistent, predictable policy framework that signals long-term intent, which will in turn increase the confidence of a range of market participants to innovate and partner. And we are one of those partners. And we can work with the private market as we've demonstrated and deliver new supply and renew the supply that is there in the social and affordable housing system. But it does require a consistency of intent from government. The second is a strong and effective regulatory system. Now, the community housing sector is fairly well regulated, although not consistently. We have a national regulatory system that doesn't include Victoria or Western Australia, and there are inconsistent standards. I think we also make the observation that the social housing system as a whole only has regulation for a very small subset, which is community housing. Public housing is not held to the same account, it's not held to the same standards. We worked with KPMG and we have a view that PowerHousing believes that that has to change, that over time there has to be a view that social housing should have a baseline that is applicable to all participants in the social housing system, which will lift the standard for everyone, and we see that as critical. The national regulatory system is an effective oversight and regulatory tool. It's complemented by a range of other regulatory functions that provide oversight of our businesses, the Corporations Act and others. These regulatory oversights increase confidence for private capital to invest into the sector. They provide a mechanism by which investors can start to understand how effectively we're being run and have some confidence that there is oversight should there be any difficulties. So PowerHousing believes that regulation and consistent regulation and a true national regulatory system is an important part of the future. The third component is what we're terming opportunity-led aggregation. Governments can stimulate industry and development of our sector by providing a pipeline of opportunities. We recognise that there needs to be further aggregation within the sector and within the system. We need to build scale and capacity. One of the best ways to do that is through market-led responses to opportunities that government puts into the market. There is a need for further aggregation. There are opportunities for us to explore a spectrum of how that may look. At one end, it may look like some of the work that's being done through PowerHousing at the moment to look at things like an aggregated financing vehicle. In fact, we did have a meeting yesterday of a number of providers to talk about furthering a piece of work, and we've agreed to fund a piece of work with PwC through the community of practice to look at what a member-driven piece of work would look like for a bond aggregation vehicle. We're aware the federal government is looking at it, but we believe that we have to be authors of our own future. We have to take that step, and it has to be industry-led, and we hope that we'll be able to work with federal and state governments in due course. So it may sit at that end of the spectrum, or it may be about us looking at whether in furtherance of the mission of our organisations, aggregation means mergers. In terms of aggregation and mergers, I find it particularly interesting to reflect on where the UK social housing system is, and Angela will speak to this through some of the sessions today. But there's been a particular piece of news which I found very interesting in the UK over the last few weeks, which is a mega merger in London. L&Q is a very significant provider. They've announced a merger with two other parties, and they're forming an entity that will have 139,000 units of housing. And the business case for that has been driven in an environment where the investment from government is shrinking. Their business case says that over the next 10 years, that entity will deliver 100,000 new units of supply in the London market. 50,000 of those units will be market sale, 30,000 will be shared equity, and 20,000 will be affordable housing. But it is about providers saying, one of the things that we have the lever on, that we control, that's within our remit, is to ask ourselves the question, in furtherance of the mission that we serve, is it best for our organisation to consider that we should be merging? So the real challenge for each of us as leaders in the system and as leaders in our organisations is to ask that reflective question of ourselves. To what extent is our own ego preventing us from looking at that question and saying, is the future of the work of the organisation, is the future of the mission of the organisation best served through pursuing a merger? And to what extent might my own views or my own sense of job security be clouding that? Now, I'm not putting a proposition to you that mergers are the only way forward for the sector, but it is one of the things over which we do exercise the greatest degree of control as opposed to some of the policy levers within government. I'm also not advocating a view that scale or size necessarily represents efficiency or effectiveness, but it is a part of the consideration and it should be part of our future. And that's a little bit about us demonstrating to our stakeholders that we understand that this is about industry-led development as much as about responding to public policy. The last pillar that we see as critically important is that public policy and the frameworks that create investment opportunity must also place a value on the quality of outcomes for tenants. It's probably in everyone's mind in this room a foregone conclusion, but we need to continually rely on policymakers that housing is more than a roof. Housing is a mechanism for increasing social and economic participation. It's a mechanism for change, and that has to be valued. It's not about just the bricks and mortar. This is something that took me as a former developer quite some time to come to grips with. There are people that live in houses. Housing is a means for change. But we need to remind public policymakers, and that needs to be considered in the context of how investment is driven. Because simply placing someone in a house won't resolve many of the issues, particularly for people coming into the social housing system. Power Housing members have demonstrated the ability to measure these outcomes. We're developing more sophisticated tools to help us to do that, to measure and to tell the story. Our members have the expertise and skills in working across communities with individuals to build social and economic capacity, whilst also operating within a sustainable business framework. So these outcomes must be considered as part of the value proposition that community housing puts, and valued as such in funding and allocation assessments by government and to the future policy framework. Those 4 components that are drawn out from the KPMG report, they don't form the full solution. We're not proposing that we have all the answers. Community housing isn't the panacea, we're not the silver bullet, but we are a critical part of the future of a housing system that will better respond to the needs of Australians. Each of us, the underlying premise here is that each of us are leaders in our organisations, we're leaders in the housing system, and that my encouragement to each of you is to ask yourselves, what can you do to change things, what can you do to act? Each of us in this room has an obligation and the opportunity to be part of creating a better housing future. Thank you.